You're listening to the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. Today's episode is my top 5 takeaways from the conversation I had last week with my adult daughters about their toxic grandparents. Are you a Catholic wife grappling with challenging in-laws? The Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast is your sanctuary for navigating these sometimes stormy seas of life with toxic in-laws, while being validated for what you've experienced. Join me, your host, Miriam Susan, a Catholic wife who's weathered nearly 3 decades of in-law drama, as we tackle the tough issues you're dealing with head on. Hey, Miriam Susan here. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. If you have not listened to my episode from last week, where I have a whole bunch of questions that I throw at 3 of my 4 adult daughters, I highly encourage you to go back, listen to that episode first. There's a lot of giggles. There's a lot of interrupting each other, which is just kind of how conversations go in our family. But we kind of go into a lot of different areas. And there was so much that we covered that I will be talking about my takeaways in today's episode. So if you don't have that context, I encourage you, get in your podcast app, hit that back button, find that last episode, and listen to that one first. So let me go ahead and jump right in with the top 5 takeaways that I had from that conversation last week with my daughters about what it was like for them, how they experienced having toxic grandparents. My biggest takeaway is that kids feel tension in your relationships, even if you do your best to try to conceal it. Like I said in last week's episode, my husband and I basically did not do anything to clue our kids in that there was any issues with his parents until within just a few months, literally about 3 months before we went no contact. And so they knew pretty much from the very beginning that there were issues in our relationship. My youngest daughter said that she just had this knowing that things were tense. And outside of that episode, she told me that she doesn't remember a time not feeling that tension. So even if you feel like you are doing a great job, you're not talking bad about your in-laws, you're not bringing those things up, your kids know. They see it in your body language. They see it in how you change when you're around your in-laws. They see the stress, the anxiety, the overwhelm that comes before any visit. They see how you have to decompress after they leave. Kids see it, they feel it, and chances are they don't have words for it. So my biggest takeaway, the first one, kids do feel the tension, even if you do your best to try to protect your in-laws. Second big takeaway is that kids know what the difference is between conditional and unconditional love, whether they can articulate it or not. My daughters said that they described their relationship with my husband's parents, with my in-laws, as having to be on their best behavior, having to be polite. And with my parents, they had a very different relationship where they felt more relaxed, where they could be themselves, where they could say what they wanted and not feel like it might hurt my parents' feelings, where they did feel like they had to be very careful with what they said around my in-laws because they didn't want to hurt specifically my mother-in-law's feelings. And that's something that I didn't ever think about. I didn't realize that that's how they felt, that they felt like they had to be restrained with what they said, that they had to be on their best behavior at all times. And I guess I kind of felt the same way. I kind of felt like I had to be on my best behavior. I had to watch what I said, and I could be much more relaxed in myself being with my parents. And I guess at the time, I just kind of thought, well, it makes sense that I would be more comfortable around my parents because they're my parents. But that really doesn't matter because I felt like I could be myself around my husband's grandparents. So his parents, moms and dads, there was just a different dynamic. And my kids, now that they're older, now that they can look back and see, through an adult's eyes, what things were like growing up based on what their memories are, they realized that there was a condition on the love that they were receiving from my in-laws. As sad as that is to say, they felt like they had to act and be and speak and dress a certain way around my in-laws to receive any kind of quote unquote love, where they did not feel that way around my parents. So that is my second takeaway for last week's episode. My third takeaway was not needing boundaries with people is a sign of a healthier relationship. I had never really sat down and thought about the fact that I didn't really have boundaries with my parents. Maybe perhaps I didn't allow them to talk us out of going to church. That's pretty much the only thing I can think of looking back that we had a real boundary on, or no toys at the table. That was a big one. My mom was perfectly willing to give my kids a toy when we were sitting down to eat, and that was one of our family rules that I did try to enforce when I was at her house. But the fact that my husband and I didn't have to sit down and talk about what we were going to do, what we were going to allow, what we were not going to allow with my parents and with my husband's grandparents is very telling. It is very telling. If you don't have to think about saying no alone time with the children, no taking rides in the car with grandma and grandpa, no spending the night over at grandma and grandpa's house. If you don't have to do those things, chances are it is a healthier relationship. Now, if you grew up in a family with a lot of dysfunction and you married your husband who has dysfunction in his family, this might be a little bit more difficult to use as a gauge for what is a healthy relationship and what is not, because you might have some dysfunctional habits that you have carried on from how your family was into your new family. So I will make that statement that, if you are coming from both sides of your family, you and your husband, with some dysfunction, then perhaps this is not the best takeaway for you to apply. But if not, if your family was relatively healthy and you can feel like you're at ease, you don't have to worry about, having to tell your mom and dad certain things that the kids are not allowed to do. That's a sign that your relationship is probably healthier than the one with your in-laws. Now, the fourth takeaway that I got from this chat with my daughters is not to talk about issues with your in-laws in front of your kids unless you're ready to change, unless you're ready to take action. I will say that our third daughter, she was very anxious to get stuff done. She wanted us to contact an attorney. She wanted us to take action. She wanted us to call the police. She has a very strong sense of justice. And so for her to realize that, yes, mom and dad know that there's something going on and we're not ready to do anything about it, was very frustrating, I think, for her, because like I said, she has a very strong sense of justice. She wants things to be right, and to be in the situation where she has no control over that, I think was very frustrating for her. And it could be for your kids as well. You can talk about this in front of your kids and then do nothing. And I think what that kind of teaches them is that you can tolerate really toxic behavior and it's okay, even if you don't think it is. That's kind of like the message where you say, kids, watch what you do, and they hear what you say, but they really watch what you do. And I think that's one of the situations where that applies, where our kids are watching what we're doing more than what we're saying. And so if you are talking about issues with your in-laws and your kids are listening, your kids are within earshot, and yet you're not taking action, you're not putting up boundaries, you're not saying, this is not acceptable to our family, it's probably not sending a very healthy message to your kids. I wanted to interrupt this podcast to talk with you about kind of the elephant in the room, the holidays. Yes, the holidays are soon upon us, and if you have toxic or challenging or even just kind of controlling in-laws, you're probably not facing Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's with the sense of joy and peace and anticipation that I feel like our Lord would have us approach it with. Instead, you're probably feeling a sense of dread, a sense of overwhelm, a sense of anxiety and stress because you know that if this holiday goes like last year and the year before, it's going to be kind of miserable. I want to give you the opportunity to get a resource that will really help you take control back from these toxic in laws that you have and bring some joy and peace to your holidays. It is my Scripts for Toxic In-Laws Holiday Edition. This is a collection of over 20 different scenarios and conversations to go along with it. If you have an issue with gift giving with your in-laws, there's a conversation that you can use about that. If you have issues with your family traditions, there's one about that. If you have an issue with scheduling or food, all of that is covered inside the Scripts for Toxic In-Laws Holiday Edition. I want you to enter into this holiday season with a sense of calm and confidence, knowing that you can approach these difficult conversations with a charitable heart towards your in-laws. If you're tired of struggling with how to talk to your in-laws about things that really matter to you, but you feel like you've just kind of been steamrolled over in the past, I encourage you, go to desiringpeace.com/holiday and get your copy of the Scripts for Toxic In-Laws Holiday Edition. This is your opportunity to make this holiday season different than all of the rest. Don't let another moment pass. Pause this podcast, head over to desiringpeace.com/holiday to get your copy now. Let's go back to the episode. My fifth and final point, unless I come up with another one on the fly, for my takeaways from last week's episode was by not addressing issues, kids take behaviors as normal, which ties into that last one. My girls talked about how they could see that things were kind of weird, that they were kind of different with my in-laws, but they would not have necessarily recognized it as toxic until we started talking about it. So my girls talked about how when we finally started talking about how the behavior was just so dramatic and bad and unhealthy and toxic and all those things, it was after they witnessed something, which ended up being that my in-laws came back by our house after we had told them not to, and they totally disregarded our wishes and came by our house anyway. Them seeing that was what caused us to start openly speaking about it. They were older too. So this was in 2019. So my oldest would have been 21, then 19, then I think 16, then 14 or 13. And then the boys would have been 11 and almost 5. And at that point, we kind of had to talk about it. The kids had all witnessed the drive-by, how my daughter described it as like verbally assaulting my husband in the street of our neighborhood. The Pandora's box was opened, basically. And it wasn't until that point that they were able to kind of have a peg to hang these memories on that they had, because their memories just were, okay, well, that's just how she is. All of these things that, we have probably heard from our husbands or from extended family when we're talking about these issues with the toxic family member. That's just how they are. You're too sensitive. We just have to love her anyway. We just have to forgive and move on. We have to forbear. All these things, they didn't make sense to my children in the context of what they actually were. So once they realized that, holy cow, this is not normal, this is pretty freaky, this is toxic behavior, basically they had all these memories of things that they knew were not quite right. They had these memories of tension. They had these experiences of conditional love versus unconditional love. They knew that there were certain boundaries, certain lines that they couldn't cross, walking on eggshells with my in-laws, but it didn't make sense until we put it in the right context. By not talking about what is actually happening, by not addressing the behaviors, the manipulation, the deception, the gaslighting, whatever it is, by not addressing it, your kids probably think that is normal. And so I highly encourage you to do what my daughter said. Their suggestion was, if you put up boundaries, do it sooner than later. If you see that your boundaries are not respected, cut off contact sooner rather than later. These are their words, paraphrased, of course. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that. There's not a lot of information out there about the grandchild's perspective. And so that's why I wanted to do this episode. I wanted to give your kids a voice by hearing my kids. Now, I realize that not every family is going to have the same experience. Your kids will probably have a different experience than mine because each of our family dynamics is different. However, I think there are some broad interpretations that can come from the conversation with my daughters that could apply to your family. Yes, every child is going to be different. We have 6 kids, so I feel like we kind of cover most of the different personality styles in our family. And I will say that none of our children, sadly, none of our children want anything to do with their grandparents because of how they've treated us, because of how they were treated themselves. And I think that says a lot. I think that says a lot that none of our children want anything to do with their grandparents. And as sad and as tragic as that sounds, I think it's the right decision. They don't want to bring that kind of drama into their lives for the future. They don't want to bring that into their marriage. It's already there. They already have to take some of it with them. They already have scars that they cannot erase, but they don't want to take that into their future marriages and into the lives of their future children. There really is so much to be learned from our children. And I am the first to admit that I learned quite a bit by talking with my daughters. Like I said, we did not rehearse anything. Nothing was scripted, which if you listen to the episode, I think you can pretty much tell that. But we don't really talk about this very much. They don't like talking about their grandparents because it's nothing but tension. Again, it brings up bad memories. It brings up stress into their lives, and they really just want to leave well enough alone. And so to have this conversation with them was very insightful because I was able to see where my husband and I didn't do the best job in raising them, in protecting them from his parents. And we just didn't have the words, we didn't have the resources available that are available now to really understand what we were going through. We didn't know what boundaries were. We knew that we had certain expectations that we wanted to have with my in-laws, and we knew when they were broken. We didn't know anything about gaslighting. We didn't know anything about narcissism or personality disorders or anything like that. We just knew we didn't like how we were being treated. And having this conversation with my daughters was really confirmation that our family has made the right decision in going no contact. They want to remain no contact. It is not by force. It is a choice that they have made. And it gives me a sense of peace, knowing that they support us in that very, very difficult decision that my husband and I had to make. So I hope that you do get a chance to go back and listen to last week's episode and let me know if your takeaways were a little bit different than mine. I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to send me an email, hello@desiringpeace.com, and let me know what your thoughts were. Did you have something different that you took away from this conversation that I had with my daughters. And like they said at the end of the episode, if you have any other questions that you would like them to address, they are willing to come back and get behind the mic and do another podcast episode for you. Just reach out, hello@desiringpeace.com, and I will pass those questions along to them, get them behind the mic, and we can do another conversation to give you some insights into what it's like for our children when we have toxic in-laws. So God bless you. Thank you so much for tuning in. Go in peace. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. I have a free gift for you that I would love for you to get. It is my free scripts for toxic in-laws. It's a little PDF that you can use to give you some examples of how to speak to your in-laws about certain issues. I'd love to give it to you absolutely free. So if you head to desiringpeace.com/gift, it will be there waiting for you. Just enter your name and email so you can start using it for inspiration on how to talk with your toxic in-laws. Again, thanks so much for tuning in. Go to desiringpeace.com/gift to claim your gift now. Disclaimer. All content and information on this podcast and our website, including our programs, products, and or services, is for information and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional medical, psychiatric, or mental health advice of any kind, and does not establish any kind of professional client relationship by your listening to this podcast or use of my website. A professional client relationship with you is only formed after we have expressly entered into a written agreement with you that you have signed, including our fee structure and other terms to work with you in a specific matter. Although we strive to provide accurate general information, the information presented here is not a substitute for any kind of professional advice, and you should not rely solely on this information. Always consult a professional in the area for your particular needs and circumstances prior to making any professional, medical, or mental health related decisions.